I'm the director of the Chicago Institute for the Moving Image, and we're a privately funded research organization that uses cinema and other media to explore visualization and language of the brain. That'll make a whole lot more sense when we break for lunch. We sponsor a wide variety of academic activities, and what we like to do is we like to bring together people from various different disciplines to explore the five senses and how we go about regulating intention with activity. I wanted to start off with a quote that I thought might get us in the mood for this. This is a quote actually from a book called A Guide to Earth History by Richard Carrington. And he wrote, "Science, art, and religion, evolving to new insight from their starting place in the mind of primitive man, are inseparable processes. They're all techniques of knowledge, operating with equal validity at different levels of awareness."
I'm here to speak to you on intention, movement, perception. I was the guy who came up with the crazy title for this conference, primarily because the two fields that I specialize in, cinema and its relationship with biomechanics and neuropsychology, people who work in these fields use these terms loosely. And one of the things that I found is that they have a role outside of these fields, perhaps in philosophy, whether you're talking about Kant, or it may have to do with anthropology if you're talking about Levi-Strauss. So what I wanted to do today is to talk about where these words are projected from, and the way to do that is to find where two key worlds collide. The world of neuropsychology and the world of cinema. And one thing that I found in my research is that these two worlds, in fact, were born almost at the same time. At the turn of the century, in the West, there was Freud and his school, but also in Russia, there was Pavlov, Petrov, what we now call reflexologists. Basically guys who sat around with dogs and hit their knee and waited to see if they'd kick something. And in a way, this was a form of psychology because they were trying to interpret how groups reacted together, but in a physiological way. And I suppose the difference between the Western school of psychology and the Russian school was that the Russians were more interested in physiology. Now the same is true of cinema. Russian cinema, which began in the early teens when the Lumiere brothers brought their equipment to Petersburg and Moscow for the first time, was in many ways an imitation of what was happening in the West. They were trying to make these kinds of romantic movies that would show couples kissing, and it was very light, innocuous comedies. But what happened after a while is they found that the audience was not responding because it wasn't grim and miserable enough like their lives. So what the Russians started doing before the Russian Revolution, of course, is that they would chop off the happy endings on the movies and then reshoot a miserable ending, which they would add to the movie so that people would cry. In a sense, they were more interested in the extreme physiological reaction of the spectator. And this laid the framework of what would happen in the Soviet Union in the early years in cinema, and strangely enough in what we now call neuropsychology. But what we now call neuropsychology, and this term is invented by Karl Pribram, this is a new term, was then called reflexology, it was called objective psychology, it was called collective reflexology, and the list of terms go on forever and ever and ever. But the main question that filmmakers and psychologists or psychiatrists were dealing with up until around the year 1930 was, how can we detect and depict intention, movement, perception, and this as a chain of events in activity? So what we're talking about in both cinema and neuropsychology is an interest in the physiology of activity. How do you get from point A to point B? One guy, his name was Nikolai Bernstein. No one has heard of this guy. Most neuropsychologists have never even heard of him. And yet he really is, I guess, more than Karl Pribram, like Josh says. Bernstein was what I would call the father of modern neuropsychology. This guy was the head of the Central Institute of Labor in the early 1920s. On the second page, you'll find diagrams from his laboratory. and photographs that he took, and a copy, of course, of one of his books, The Coordination and Regulation of Movements. What this guy did, he was completely crazy. In 1926, he said, let me get a couple ballerinas, dress them in black, put some polka dots on them, and then film them, and watch the dots. And study how people are looking at the dots. And study how the dots get from one point to another, how many steps it takes. And watch them do repeated movements using these dots. And see, would it be every single time? Was it moving like this? He was playing connected dots, a very, very fancy form of connected dots. And he was not the first, by the way. The Pythagoreans in ancient Greece were doing the same things. I mean, they would have wheels with dots on them, and they would watch how people would study their movement. But Bernstein was the first to say, hey, I can use this new technology to do it. This was not even being done in the West. So what's very interesting for me is that while we haven't heard of Nikolai Bernstein, neuropsychologists who work today have not heard of Nikolai Bernstein. Soviet filmmakers knew Nikolai Bernstein's movies and studied them. And what was interesting for me was to be able to trace this influence of this very obscure but extremely important branch of psychology in cinema. Now, what are some of the achievements that Bernstein made so that we could find symptoms of these kinds of collisions in the bridge of these two worlds? Essentially, what are these suspenders for this bridge? Well, Bernstein discovered, after filming a guy hitting a nail with a hammer, as you see in the bottom right corner of your page, that every single time you hit a nail on the head with a hammer, you're not hitting it exactly the same way. So where Pavlov would say, if you don't know how to hit a nail with a hammer, you should do it a few times, eventually you'll learn. Bernstein would say, you may not learn. It's possible that even if you hit it a trillion times, you'll never really hit the nail. Well, the reason for that is this. Before the brain is trying to send a signal to the arm, or the wrist and the elbow to hit this thing, it creates a three-dimensional picture of this nail and hammer and tries to determine the best way to hit this nail. The evidence for this is that on the nail, there were different marks on the head. So every time the guy was hitting the nail, he was hitting it in a slightly different way to compensate for friction, to compensate for changing in gravity. The nail's falling a little bit more this way or more that way. And what we're learning then is that the brain has a capacity to think in three dimensions. And this is why, for example, I'm able to sign my name in big letters in the air with the same proportions as I would on a piece of paper. Creates these models before we act, stores them like memories, and uses them when it can, when it needs to. But they can also create damage to a psyche, because it's like, as Bernstein points out, that if you imagine that you've cheated on your diet, it's just as bad as cheating on your diet, because your metabolism might speed up or slow down, and you'll be depressed. So there is what Freud might call the unconscious space is a subset of what Bernstein calls the holographic space. No, he doesn't call it, I call it that. The holographic sphere of the brain. And what I would like to show you is how this actually translates into action. How important filmmakers actually who went to Bernstein's lectures tried to make some sense out of this. Try to depict and detect where's the intention of this person who's acting and how is it accomplished. Imagine the editing is not happening like this, but like in a normal film, a progression of shots. Please try. Now, think of it like this. There's this guy, right? Think of that as the first shot of the film. You see this guy, and I want you to tell me his relationship to the following shots. That's what Kuleshov was trying to do here. He's trying to make a point. This guy is whatever he's doing, and now you have to tell me, after I show you the shots that follow, what his relationship is to the other ones.
Suche wurde mit einem Kindersarg montiert, mit einem Teller Suppe, mit einem spielenden Kind und so weiter. Es gab viele Varianten.
Okay, so what is the relationship? Is there a relationship? I mean, did you make some sense out of it? You did, but you have to tell me what it is. Everyone does. Everyone makes sense out of everything. Otherwise, we couldn't exist. So is anyone willing to share that understanding? Okay. Another one? Very good.
he's the coroner. She was an actress. She died. Showed the clip from the most recent film. Started off as a child movie star. Poisoned by soup. There you go.
I'd like to give this man $5 for that. That's brilliant. Do you know why? Because it's incorrect, but in a way that could not help my lecture more. But you're supposed to do that. You see, the whole point is that these things have nothing to do with each other. That was one shot taken from one movie. All these shots are taken from movies that were never made together, even. Kuleshov is trying to show that you can take all these symbols and images that have nothing to do with each other, and you will project understanding onto it. All because of montage. And foolishly, he believed that this is all because you are interested in the connection between things. Eisenstein, however, is more interested in showing that, in fact, no, you're not doing it through some connection. You're not building the house by putting bricks together. You're building the house by smashing the bricks together, as Eisenstein would say. You're taking the things that don't make sense and putting them together. And here, none of these things make sense. And that is the process by which you make sense out of it. And you know what? That's the way that we make sense out of absolutely everything. The way that I can perceive depth is that there's a conflict between the way that my voice projects to there, to there. You see what I mean? Or so I can perceive depth. Or by the way that I see colors, there is what neuropsychologists correctly call contrast between colors and shapes that allow me to perceive things. But what Eisenstein, because he was a Marxist, called conflict, right? And so he took a metaphor from the revolution and applied it to art. We see intention because of exaggeration, projected or real. Movement is achieved just as we perceive movement through conflict, recoil, contradiction. Think about, and also three-dimensional images. Think about when you're, imagine yourself walking or hiking up a mountain. So often, as you're hiking, you step on some kind of stones that are not flat, but you don't see them, and yet your foot knows exactly what to do, even though you've never done it before. It's because before you got there, your brain has a capacity for prediction and probability, which is projected onto the world in which it's reacting, and it allows this activity to happen, even though it's completely contradictory and in conflict with the material world. So, there it is. Any questions? What it brings us to is that, in a way, cinema is a language of its own that can be developed on its own, like English or ASL or a whole slew of other things. But strangely enough, once it is developed in a way that brings out human activity, it reveals the language of the brain. But it's not idiotic, because when you think of your computer, it's humans that designed it, so it's natural that you're projecting yourself into it. But it's strange that cinema, because it manipulates movement and activity, brings it out much more than the traditional beaux-arts, like painting or whatever. And also, I would go so far as to say that when you see the language of the brain in all these other fields, you're seeing cinema. You're seeing montage in action. Eisenstein was interested in specific mathematical assembly of images to bring out physiological response and projection of physiological response. So, one, he's going to show you how people react and act. Two, he's going to make you react. Because actually, Eisenstein wrote quite a bit about Moses' time in the desert with the Jews. And what he wrote about was interesting. He wrote this in his journals when he was in Mexico, which were never published. I found them at Eisenstein's apartment when I was in Moscow. He talks a lot about how the Jews who were in the desert, their physiological reactions to things were heightened. So their ability to perceive was heightened. Their ability to recognize was heightened. And this is also part of the question of mirages and things like that, whether you can see it or not. Regardless of whether you see a mirage or not, it can still exert a physiological reaction to it. You can believe that you're interacting with a mirage, and it can also hurt you or help. Well, that's also why I believe in making cinema not only a mass medium, but working with individuals. So making one movie for one person based on their psychosis, like I did for Scotch.
But how do you know what their event is, and how can you play on that?
Psychoanalysis is often one of the ways to do it.
Then why can't psychoanalysis stand alone?
They should. I'm not arguing. I just think they should make movies. I think psychoanalysts would learn very well to make movies for their patients in some cases. But one other thing I wanted to say is that you're absolutely right. There is an event, but how do you know it's in the material world? It may be in the holographic space.
Very true.
And this is what cinema can speak to that regular psychoanalysis may not be able to. Or psychoanalysis can, they just aren't.
Or a melding of the two. Psychoanalysis can show images, in order, as if that's what you're saying.
Absolutely right.
Because images will certainly provoke.
But the moment you're doing it, you're speaking to the language of the brain, i.e. cinema. Because the way that the mathematics actually involved, the way that we do all of this stuff, is cinema. It all comes down to Fourier's formula of how light is projected. And the way that we store images is identical to the way that we, in cinema is the same way that we make physical three-dimensional holograms. I don't want to be a reductionist or essentialist and say, well, it's all the same soup, but it is. So it's, in that case, because it's more work, I'm going to be putting more of myself into it. But the point of it is not that I'm going to cure anybody, because it won't happen. In holographic cinema, maybe in art therapy it will. Holographic cinema won't probably be very effective in those ways, but the cinema itself will be more effective. So I'm not saying that I will be successful, I'm only as good as my hands are in working the apparati. But the technique of striving in this direction will make the movies better, because they're speaking not only in a vague, broad, unscientific, unmathematical way, but they're directly speaking to the part of you that's interested in it, that was attracted to the film in the first place. When you buy Dexatrin, I've tried every diet and drug on the planet, not just because I'm interested in cinema and seeing how it alters my brain, but also trying to see if I can lose some weight. And the interesting thing I've learned, aside from the fact that it might cause strokes, is that in a way, these things, all of them, have placebo effects. And this is one part of it that the client, because he comes with goodwill, it may have a better effect on him. If he comes to me as a human who's skeptical because he hasn't paid, he's a human, right? He's just my mom. Let's say I'm making a movie for my mom, right? I'm talking to them as a person, not as a person who's paying me, and I'm making a movie to try to help because I care. Well, if that person is skeptical, then it will have less of an effect. All things and all the sciences require some placebo effect, just to make it work, because you need goodwill on both ends. And that's what placebo effect is. It's goodwill. It's good intentions.
You know, there is a marvelous mystical text, and it's called Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. And it was written by an unknown mystical Jewish philosopher in the 3rd century CE, and it became the most important Hebrew text on language and cosmology just before the Renaissance. The text is a treatment of divine language and its relationship to the cosmos. And the mystical text teaches that God created the world using language and by use of language. In other words, creation was the direct result of language. This language was employed by God to create. Furthermore, we see that the power of creation actually resides in language, and that the Hebrew letters were instruments with which God created the cosmos. And so God chose language as his tool because the powers needed for creation were inherent in language, and inherent in language they continue to reside. This Sefer Yetzirah is a linguistic commentary on the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, teaching us not only the symbolic meaning, but the creative power of the Hebrew letters. Here we have the Hebrew letters. Now, the mystical text, Sefer Yetzirah, and subsequently almost every other Kabbalistic text, and I'll tell you, that Kabbalah is another term for Jewish mysticism. Almost every other Jewish mystical text maintains that ordinary languages represent reality. And that we know. Letters and words represent objects. But not so with the holy tongue of Hebrew. The Hebrew letters themselves are the truest reality. Immutable, eternal, like the forces of nature. Now here's the fascinating thing. It is fascinating for Hebrew text to maintain this. It is more fascinating when the Quran maintains this. The Quran is not a Hebrew text. And this is completely substantiated by Hadith literature. That's the interpreted literature of Islamic thought. And these Hebrew letters are similar to Plato's forms as he discusses them in his Republic. Now, the Hebrew letters for Sefer, Samach Fei Reish, these are forces of nature that give the book its real reality. So in Hebrew, the letters aren't representational symbols. In Hebrew, the letters are divine forces. So while the English word for book is a symbol for the concrete book, in the Hebrew language, letters are the very building blocks with which God created the universe, and with which God continues to create the universe. Now this mystical text, Sefer Yetzirah, deals with scripture and symbols and language relating to the science and structure of energy. So when God wished to create man or woman or book or table, he articulated these letters, he spoke these letters, which are called otyot in Hebrew. These otyot are forces of divine energy. God manipulated these forces, these letters, in such a way as he could manipulate creation. Now there's another wonderful mystical text. It's the Bible of all mystical texts. It's called the Zohar. 13th century Spanish Kabbalistic text. It accepts this thinking of Sefer Yetzirah and maintains that the Hebrew letters are thought projections of cosmic energy. Not just words formed by idiomatic usage. There was intentionality in the mind of God at the dawn of creation. God used these Hebrew letters like Plato would use the eternal forms. God used the energy of the Hebrew letters to create. There's a wonderful Kabbalistic text, another one called Sefer Hechalot. It's a 6th century work. It's a German work. I mean, it's a Hebrew German work. And it teaches that God crowned the biblical Enoch with a crown which contained, and I translated this, so I'm going to re-quote it. God crowned the biblical Enoch with a crown which contained the Hebrew letters, the letters by which mountains and hills were created, letters by which the stars and constellations and lightning and winds and thunders and snow and hail and tempest and storm were created, the letters by which all the necessities of the world and all the laws of creation were created. Now here's the amazing, conclusion, and the basis of why I'm here. What is amazing is that if we humans could master these Kabbalistic texts, we also have within us the power to use Hebrew letters as instruments to create in this world as human beings. That the proper understanding of the nature of language can allow a human being to employ language as God employs it. In other words, we can use language not only for the purpose of communication, we can use language for the purpose of creation. This means that God not only gave man permission to use language for his own communicative needs, but also for the creative aspects of language. And this use of language was discovered by the mystics as indispensable in the hands of theologians, physicians, and artists. So far we see the correlation of language and creation. Now, the author of this magnificent mystical text, Sefer Yetzirah, adds one more ingredient. He maintains that if the world was created by language and continues to be sustained by language, then the laws of language are actually the laws of creation. And when we investigate the structure of language, when we investigate the structure of grammar, we investigate the nature and structure of the universe and everything in it, including man. So the entire book of Sefer Yetzirah presents the creative process as a process by which God uses, in a sense, a celestial typewriter. God uses the Hebrew letters in different combinations to produce everything in existence. But the language of creation vis-a-vis man is a little bit different. Before I spoke about the artist Bezalel, who was entrusted with supervising the artistic creation of the ancient temple in the wilderness when the Hebrews escaped Egypt. And remember, the Talmud says that Bezalel was given the task because he was knowledgeable in the letters by which heaven and earth were created. Now God, when He created the world, He imbued the letters with intentionality. And so when Bezalel created the tabernacle, he already had access to the forces of the universe because the letters were already imbued with intentionality. So when Bezalel created the tabernacle, he had letters that were even stronger than God's letters initially, than God's raw letters prior to God investing intentionality into the letters. So we, human beings, have at our disposal the power to create, and in a sense, even greater than God's power to create. Because these letters are identified with forces of nature, bundles of energy, that are already imbued with the first level of intentionality. But he microfilms those and copies them and then sells them. So he sold me a Hebrew medieval mystical text called Sefer HaTmunah, written in the 14th century. This text sees language as a collection of pictures with signs and sounds. And the picture of God, the vision of God, what is that? These are the pictures of the letters themselves. The Zohar, the book of Jewish mysticism, as I explained earlier, maintains the same theory. You know, in normative Judaism, visualization of a divine entity is not allowed. Visualization and prayer, for normative Judaism, if you visualize a divine entity, becomes troublesome. But visualization is embraced by the early and later Kabbalists or mystics. I myself use these mystical techniques every day in my work as a rabbi. I use the techniques of visualization, intention, and the power of the Hebrew letters in my work in prayer, specifically in my work in healing prayer. Because prayer to me is an art. As much as an art as is painting or drawing or playing different musical instruments. Because mysticism is a visionary experience. And most description of the mystical experience involve color and light and images. In Judaism, in normative Judaism, prayer is an auditory experience. You know, the terms associated with prayer are listening or hearing. And the urgent request of the worshiper in prayer, God, please hear me. We don't say, God, please see me. We say, God, please hear me. But in Jewish mysticism, prayer becomes an art that needs to be developed and perfected. So I shared with you how mysticism, prayer, and language illustrates the relationship between movement, intention, and visualization.
This is a poem that we're putting on the first page, opposite her introduction to this poem. The Lone Actor, she called it. Like the Lone Ranger. She's an American woman. It's called Crystal Ball, and her poetry is the size of it. I do, I used to. She's her ideas. To the which she did go, should be her, to find out what the future holds. The secret of following is told. Present time you must find, and within it dwell, for there is the key that opens the door to the great mystery, and the future you will see. But hark, if in present time you cannot dwell, You'll have no future to foretell. Trapped in the past, you'll always be. So she went forth to dwell in present time. But alas, present time, like the divine, is most difficult to find. The handbook of theater games for the solo player, you will learn to enter present time no matter what is going on around you through a direct, right now experience. Present time is used here as not clock time. It is a moment of full consciousness, awareness, continuous time, a timeless moment, whether seconds, minutes, or hours, with all of your responses awake and alert, ready to guide you and come to your aid, free of past do's and don'ts. Should I or shouldn't I? In present time, a path is open to your intuition, closing the gap between thinking and doing, allowing you, the real you, your natural self, to emerge and experience directly and act freely, present to the moment you are present to. Then she gives some advice. You, the real you, must be seen. There are many facets to your basic persona, unknown even to you, that may come forth, appear, and become visible. You, the unique, invisible, unknown, must emerge, be seen, and connect. Her next chapter is called 5 Obstacles to a Direct Experience. One is the approval-disapproval syndrome, the way we're raised, by trying to please others, figuring out what they want you to say and how they want you to act, and then doing so with as much skill and originality as possible. If you do this, your approval-disapproval syndrome is highly active. You follow me? We're raised that way. You're wrong. Go to the class. This and that. There's the teachers and the parents who control, like the army in a sense, is much more mechanical. But we're all raised in this way. And she says we've learned that, and the trick is to break it. She says if you are in approval, disapproval, you are not only prevented from having a direct experience, but blind to what a direct experience is. And then she says that the approval, disapproval will monitor behavior, watch it working on you when having guests for dinner, meeting people, or in a new situation. Observe the roles, the cover-ups in you and those around you, shown by attitudes and what comes out of every mouth. Hostility, envy, competitiveness, put-downs, resentments, sarcasm, you name it. What we verbalize as our own are the controls that tie and bind, keeping us earthbound and the victim. It's called Into Your Space. I like the use of space Melissa was talking about. Into your space. As are in the space. Oh, what a very interesting. The mysterious, magical, creative comes from beyond our daily realities and will not or cannot respond until you are in communion with the as yet unknown, your intuition, your experience. The key, get out of your head, into your space, and await the invisible stranger.